The knock on the door came at midnight, and Mira Calden knew before she opened it that her life was about to change forever. Her father stood in the doorway with a man she had never seen before, and behind them, a carriage waited in the rain with its lanterns burning low. Edmund Calden's face was pale, his hands shaking, and he could not look his daughter in the eye. "Mira," he said, his voice cracking, "we need to talk. Now." She stepped aside and let them in, her heart already pounding. She had seen her father look worried before, but never like this. Never like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. The stranger who followed him inside was tall and quiet, dressed in a dark coat that dripped rainwater onto the wooden floor. He did not speak. He simply stood near the door, watching, as if he were used to waiting for other people to decide his fate. "Your father owes a debt," the stranger finally said, when Edmund could not find the words. "A debt that has grown too large to pay in coin. There is only one way to settle it now." Mira felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. What way? Her father's hands twisted together. "Marriage, Mira. To the Voss family. To his master." The word hit her like a slap. She was 23 years old, and she had never once imagined her life would be handed over, like a debt written on paper. She looked at her father, waiting for him to take it back, to say it was some cruel joke. But he only lowered his head, ashamed, and said nothing. "Who is he?" she asked. "This master of yours?" "His name is Julian Voss," the stranger answered. "He does not ask for much. He asks for a wife, and your father's debt disappears." That night, Mira did not sleep. She sat by her window, watching the rain streak down the glass, thinking of everything she had wanted for her life. She had dreamed of choosing her own path, of falling in love the way people did in stories, slowly and freely. Instead, her future had been decided for her by numbers on a page and a man she had never met. 3 days later, she stood in a small chapel at the edge of town, wearing a plain gray dress, because there had been no time and no money for anything finer. The chapel was cold and mostly empty. Only her father, a village priest, and a handful of witnesses were present, and there, waiting at the altar, stood the man she was about to marry. Julian Voss was not what she expected. She had imagined an old man, cruel and demanding, the kind of person who would collect a wife the way he collected debts. Instead, the man before her was young, perhaps only a few years older than she was, with dark hair, quiet eyes, and a face marked by a thin scar that ran along his jaw. He did not smile when she approached. He did not frown either. He simply watched her with an expression she could not read, as if he were bracing himself for something. The ceremony was short. The words were said. A ring was placed on her finger, cold and plain, and just like that, Mira Calden became Mira Voss. Julian did not touch her hand as they left the chapel. He did not offer comforting words. He simply walked beside her toward the carriage, his steps steady and quiet, like a man who had learned long ago not to expect kindness from the world, and had stopped hoping for it. The Voss estate sat at the edge of the forest, far from the noise of the town, surrounded by tall iron gates that looked as if they had not been opened in years. The house itself was large but not grand, more like a fortress than a home, with narrow windows and thick stone walls. When the carriage rolled through the gates, Mira felt a chill settle over her skin that had nothing to do with the weather. "This is where you will live now," Julian said. They were the first real words he had spoken to her since the wedding. "It's very quiet," Mira answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes," he said. "I prefer it that way." Inside, the house was clean but sparse, as if no one had ever tried to make it feel warm. There were no paintings on the walls, no clutter of a family that had lived and laughed within these rooms. Only a single old woman, a servant named Grace, greeted them at the door, her eyes flicking nervously between Julian and his new bride. "Welcome home, my lady," Grace said, though her voice trembled slightly, as if the words felt strange in her mouth. That first night, Julian showed Mira to a room of her own, separate from his. He did not explain why, and she did not ask. She was relieved, in truth, though the relief was tangled with confusion. A man who married for duty usually expected more than a name and a signature. Yet Julian Voss seemed to want nothing from her at all. Over the following days, Mira began to learn the rhythm of her strange new home. Julian rose early and worked with his hands, tending to the land, repairing fences, cutting wood, even though the estate clearly had enough wealth to hire workers for such tasks. He ate his meals in silence, offering polite but brief conversation, and retired to his study each night, behind a locked door. The villagers, when she ventured into town for supplies, treated her with a strange mixture of pity and fear. Women who once greeted her warmly, now lowered their eyes when she passed. Children were pulled away by their mothers if they wandered too close. "You married into the Voss family," an old shopkeeper murmured one afternoon, almost too quiet for Mira to hear. "May the stars have mercy on you." Mira turned sharply. "What do you mean by that?" The old woman only shook her head and busied herself with her goods, refusing to say another word. That evening, Mira decided she would ask Julian directly. She found him in the garden behind the house, sitting alone beneath a large oak tree, staring at nothing in particular. The moonlight cast long shadows across his face, making him look older than his years, as if the weight he carried was heavier than any man should bear. "The people in town are afraid of you," Mira said, sitting on the bench across from him. "Why?" For a long moment, Julian said nothing. His jaw tightened, and his hands curled into fists on his knees before he forced them to relax. "I was a soldier," he finally said, "in a war that most people prefer to forget." "What war?" "It does not have a name anymore," he said quietly. "The records were destroyed, the men who fought beside me. Most of them did not come home. But you did." His eyes met hers for the first time since the wedding, and in them, Mira saw something that startled her. Not cruelty, not coldness, but a deep and quiet grief. "Yes," he said, "I came home, and I have spent every day since wishing I understood why I was the one who survived." Mira did not know what to say. She had expected arrogance, perhaps indifference, from the man who had bought her marriage with a debt. She had not expected sorrow. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for your loss." Julian studied her for a long moment, as if surprised by her words. "You did not have to say that. I meant it." Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like a door opening a crack before closing again. "You should go inside," he said. "The nights grow cold." She rose to leave, but paused at the edge of the garden and looked back at him. "Julian," she said, testing his name for the first time, "whatever happened to you in that war, I am not afraid of you." He did not answer, but long after she had gone inside, he remained beneath the oak tree, staring up at the stars, his hands trembling slightly, in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, carefully, something between them began to shift. Julian remained quiet, but he was not unkind. He left small gifts outside her door, a carved wooden bird, a bundle of wildflowers, a book of poetry with pages worn soft from years of reading. He never mentioned them, and Mira never asked, but she began to look forward to what she might find each morning. She learned that he loved the mornings best, when the world was still and silent, before the noise of the day could intrude. She learned that he flinched at loud sounds, that his hands sometimes shook without warning, and that he often woke in the night calling out words she could not understand, words that sounded like names of men who were no longer alive to answer him. One evening, as they sat together at the long dining table, a sudden crash of thunder shook the windows. Mira jumped in her seat, startled by the sound, but when she looked up at Julian, she found him frozen entirely still, his eyes wide and distant, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. "Julian?" she said carefully. He did not answer. His breathing had grown quick and shallow, and for a moment, Mira feared he might collapse where he sat. "Julian, look at me," she said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. The moment her fingers brushed his skin, he startled, as if waking from a nightmare, his eyes snapping to hers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I did not mean to frighten you." "You didn't frighten me," Mira said gently, "but you frightened yourself. What happened just now?" He pulled his hand away and stood from the table, pacing toward the window, where rain now streaked down in heavy sheets. "There are things about me," he said slowly, "that I have not told you. Things that even I do not fully understand." "Then tell me," Mira said. "I am your wife. Whatever burden you carry, you do not have to carry it alone anymore." Julian turned to look at her, and for the first time since their wedding day, something like hope flickered across his face. quickly hidden again beneath his usual careful stillness. "Not tonight," he said. "But soon, I promise you, Mira, soon, you will understand everything." That night, as she lay awake in her room, Mira thought about the strange rumors in town, the way the villagers averted their eyes, the way even the servant Grace seemed to flinch whenever Julian raised his voice, even gently. She thought about the storm outside and the way Julian had frozen at the sound of thunder, as if the sky itself reminded him of something far more terrible. She did not know what secret her husband was hiding, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she wanted to understand it, not because duty demanded it of her, but because somewhere in the quiet, careful man she had married, she had begun to see someone worth knowing. Outside, the storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky in jagged lines of white fire, and far off in the distance, though Mira could not have known it yet, something ancient stirred inside her husband, waking slowly from a long and dangerous sleep. Weeks passed at the Voss estate, and Mira found herself settling into a life she had never expected to want. The mornings began early, with the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, and the sound of Julian's axe splitting wood behind the house. She had started joining him for breakfast without being asked, and he had started waiting for her before he began eating, though neither of them spoke of it directly. It was Grace, the old servant, who finally began to open up to Mira about the past. One afternoon, while the two women sorted linens in the small laundry room, Grace glanced toward the door to make sure they were alone before she spoke. "You should know something, my lady," Grace said quietly, "about the master's family." Mira set down the cloth in her hands. "Please, tell me." "The Voss family has always been different," Grace said. "Generations back, they say a soldier ancestor made a bargain during a terrible war. A bargain with something not entirely of this world. In exchange for saving his men, he gave up a piece of his humanity, and that piece has passed down through the bloodline ever since, sleeping in each generation, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Grace's hands trembled as she folded a sheet. "For war, my lady. For a moment terrible enough to wake it." Mira felt a chill crawl across her skin. "And Julian? Has it woken in him?" "I do not know for certain," Grace admitted, "but he came back from that war different than he left. Stronger, quieter. And there are nights when the ground itself seems to shake beneath this house, though no one else feels it but him." That evening, Mira found Julian in his study, the one room in the house she had never been permitted to enter. The door was slightly open, and through the gap, she could see him standing before an old wooden chest, staring down at its contents with an expression of quiet dread. "Julian?" He turned quickly, moving to close the chest, but not quickly enough. Mira caught a glimpse of what lay inside, a set of tarnished armor, unlike anything she had seen before, etched with symbols that seemed to shift and glow faintly even in the dim candlelight. "You should not be in here," Julian said, though his voice held no anger, only exhaustion. "Grace told me about your family," Mira said, stepping into the room, despite his words. "About the bargain. About what sleeps inside you." Julian's shoulders sank, as if a weight he had carried alone for years had finally been shared, even against his will. "Then you understand why I did not want a wife," he said, "why I did not want anyone close enough to be hurt by what I am." "I'm not afraid of what you are," Mira said, though her heart was pounding as she said it. "I want to understand you, Julian. All of you." He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether to trust her with the truth. Finally, he reached into the chest and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. A medallion, old and worn, etched with the same strange symbols as the armor. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," Julian said. "He was the one who made the bargain. He fought in a war so terrible that entire nations were erased from the map. When his men were about to be slaughtered, he begged for power beyond what any human should have, and something answered him. It gave him strength enough to turn the tide of the battle alone. But the price was that his descendants would carry a fragment of that power inside them, forever. And you," Mira said slowly, "you carry it now." "I have spent my whole life trying to keep it asleep," Julian said, "trying to be nothing more than a man. But in the war I fought, I was pushed to my limits, and for the first time, it woke inside me. I do not fully know what I became that day. I only know that when I came back to myself, the battlefield was silent, and every enemy soldier around me was gone." Mira's breath caught. "Gone how?" Julian's eyes were haunted as he answered, "I do not remember, and I am grateful, every single day, that I do not." Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Mira reached out and took his hand, the same way she had during the storm weeks before, and this time, Julian did not pull away. "You are not a monster," she said firmly. "A monster would not fear what he is capable of. A monster would not spend his life trying to protect the world from himself." "You don't know that for certain," Julian said, though his voice had softened. "I know you," Mira said. "Or at least, I am beginning to, and the man I am beginning to know is not something to fear." For the first time since their wedding, Julian allowed himself something close to a smile, faint and uncertain, but real. Life at the estate continued, and slowly, the space between them shrank. Julian began telling her small pieces of his past, not the war itself, which remained locked behind careful silence, but the years before it, his childhood in the same quiet house, his mother's laughter before illness took her, his father's stern lessons about duty and control. Mira, in turn, shared her own past, her mother's warmth, her father's mounting debts, the dreams she had once held for a different kind of life. It was on a quiet afternoon, weeks later, that everything began to change. Mira had gone into town alone to gather supplies, as she often did, when she noticed a group of unfamiliar men gathered near the market square. They wore dark uniforms she did not recognize, with insignias that made the townsfolk nervously avert their eyes and hurry past. Their leader, a tall man with sharp eyes and a cold expression, was asking questions of the shopkeepers, questions that made Mira's blood run cold when she caught fragments of them on the wind. "Looking for a soldier, survivor of the Northern Campaign, goes by the name Voss." Mira's heart pounded as she quickly finished her errands and hurried back toward the estate, glancing over her shoulder more than once, to be sure she was not followed. When she reached the house, she found Julian in the garden, and she did not waste a single moment before telling him what she had seen. His face went pale as she spoke, and by the time she finished, his jaw was clenched tight with something between fear and fury. "They found me," he said quietly. "Who are they?" Mira asked. "What do they want?" "The military," Julian said. "The same one that sent me into that war and erased every record of what happened there. They know what I became on that battlefield. They have spent years hunting down survivors like me, trying to understand the power, trying to control it. Control it how?" Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. "By turning us into weapons. By using us for wars far worse than the one I already survived." Mira felt fear coil tightly in her chest, but beneath it, something else stirred, a fierce and unfamiliar protectiveness for the man standing before her. "Then we will not let them find you," she said firmly. "Mira," Julian said, his voice heavy with warning, "if they come here, if they corner me, I do not know if I can stop what happens next. I do not know if I can control it." "Then we will make sure they never corner you," Mira said. "We will be smarter than they are. We will be ready." That night, Julian did not sleep in his usual room. Instead, he paced the halls of the house, long after midnight, checking windows, checking locks, his senses sharpened by a fear Mira had never seen in him before. She found him near dawn, standing at the edge of the property, staring out toward the road that led into town, watching for any sign of danger. "You should rest," she said softly, joining him at the fence. "I cannot," Julian admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that battlefield again. I hear the sounds I have spent years trying to forget." Mira slipped her hand into his, and this time, neither of them hesitated. "Then do not face it alone," she said. "Not this time." Julian looked down at their joined hands, and something in his expression cracked open, revealing the raw vulnerability he had spent so long hiding beneath careful stillness. "I never wanted this life for you," he said quietly. "A husband who is hunted. A husband who might not always be entirely human." "I did not choose this marriage," Mira said honestly. "But I am choosing this. Right now. I am choosing to stand beside you, Julian Voss, whatever comes next." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sun was beginning to rise over the distant hills, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, and for the first time since she had arrived at the estate, Mira felt something that resembled hope. But even as they stood together in the quiet dawn, Far off in the town below, the men in dark uniforms were gathering their forces, preparing to move, closing in on the secret that had slept for so long inside the walls of the Voss estate. The days of hiding were coming to an end, and soon Mira would witness with her own eyes exactly what her husband truly was. Grace found Mira in the kitchen later that morning, her hands trembling as she prepared a simple breakfast that neither of them would likely finish. The old servant had lived through many quiet years at the estate, and Mira could see the worry etched deep into the lines of her face. "I have served this family since before the master was born," Grace said, setting down a kettle with a shaking hand. "I remember his father, and his father before him. Each carried the same burden, though none of them ever let it wake fully, not the way it woke in the war." "Why did it wake in him and not in the others?" Mira asked. "Because none of the others were pushed so close to death," Grace answered. "The bargain only answers when the need is desperate enough. When a Voss stands at the edge of losing everything, it rises to save what can still be saved." Mira turned the words over in her mind. If the power inside Julian only answered in moments of desperate need, then perhaps it was not something to fear at all, but something that had only ever tried to protect him and the people around him. "He is not dangerous," Mira said quietly, almost to herself. "Not unless someone gives him no other choice." Grace's eyes softened. "You care for him. I can see it plainly, my lady, even if you have not said it aloud." Mira did not deny it. In the weeks since her wedding, something had shifted inside her chest, something she had not expected and could not fully name. The man she had married out of duty had slowly become someone she thought of first each morning and last each night, someone whose safety mattered to her more than her own. Later that day, Julian called for a meeting with the few loyal workers who remained on the estate, men who had served his family for years and understood, at least in part, the danger that now approached. They gathered in the main hall, and Julian laid out a plan to protect the house and the town beyond it, should the soldiers in dark uniforms return with worse intentions. "If they come only to ask questions, we answer carefully and give them nothing," Julian said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "But if they come with force, we protect the innocent first. Whatever happens to me is secondary." "Julian," Mira said sharply, stepping forward despite the surprised glances from the workers. "You are not secondary. Not to me." The room fell silent. Julian's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore around his workers slipped, revealing the same vulnerability she had seen in the quiet hours of dawn. "We protect each other," he said finally, correcting himself. "That is the plan." That night, after the workers had gone, and the house had settled into an uneasy quiet, Mira found herself unable to sleep. She rose from her bed and walked the darkened halls until she reached Julian's study, where a single candle still burned beneath the door. He was seated at his desk, staring at the old medallion that had belonged to his great-grandfather, turning it slowly between his fingers. "You should be resting," Mira said softly, stepping inside. "I keep thinking about what happens if I cannot stop it," Julian admitted, not looking up. "What happens if the soldiers come, and I lose myself entirely, and I hurt someone I am trying to protect? I have imagined it 100 times tonight." Mira crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking the medallion gently from his hands and setting it aside so she could hold his hands instead. "Then I will be there to remind you who you are," she said. "Every single time, for as long as you need me to." Julian looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a wife bound to him by debt, but as a partner chosen freely by fate. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked quietly. "You did not ask for any of this." "No," Mira agreed, "but I am choosing it now. All of it, the good and the frightening parts alike." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling softly against the windows, but this time, Julian did not flinch. He simply held onto Mira's hands, grounding himself in her presence, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps he was not facing the coming storm entirely alone. Neither of them could have known how soon that storm would truly arrive, or how much it would demand of them both. The soldiers returned 3 days later, at midday, when the sun sat high and bright over the Voss estate, offering no shadows for anyone to hide within. Mira was in the garden, gathering herbs for the kitchen, when she heard the heavy rumble of carriage wheels approaching along the main road. She straightened and looked toward the gate, her stomach dropping as she counted 6 riders in dark uniforms, led by the same sharp-eyed man she had seen in town days before. She ran inside, calling for Julian, who met her in the front hall, already dressed and composed, though his eyes betrayed the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. "Stay behind me," he said. "Whatever happens, let me speak first." The riders dismounted at the gate and approached the front steps of the house, without waiting for an invitation. Their leader removed his gloves, slowly, deliberately, as if enjoying the discomfort his presence caused. "Julian Voss," the man said, his voice smooth and cold. "My name is Colonel Ashford. I believe you already know why I am here." "I am a farmer now, Colonel," Julian said evenly. "Whatever business you had with me ended the day I left the war behind." Ashford smiled, though the expression never reached his eyes. "The war does not end simply because a man wishes it to, Voss. We have reports. Survivors from the Northern Campaign, who witnessed what happened on that final battlefield. They speak of you as something more than a soldier. Something the Empire has great use for." "I am not a weapon for you to collect," Julian said, his voice hardening. "That is not your decision to make," Ashford replied. "The Empire funded the very bloodline that gave you this power. It belongs to us as much as it belongs to you." Mira stepped forward despite Julian's earlier warning, unable to remain silent. "He is a person, not property. You have no right to claim him." Ashford's cold gaze shifted to her, assessing, calculating. "Ah, the new wife. How touching. I wonder if your affection will survive once you understand exactly what your husband is capable of." "I already know," Mira said firmly, "and it changes nothing." Ashford's smile widened, cruel and knowing. "Then perhaps you should see it for yourself." He turned and gestured to his men. "Take him. If he resists, remind him what happens to those who refuse the Empire's summons." The soldiers moved forward, weapons drawn, and Julian stepped protectively in front of Mira, his body tensing, as the memories of the battlefield surged unbidden to the surface. Mira felt the ground beneath her feet begin to tremble. Faintly at first, then more insistently, as if something ancient and powerful had begun to stir far beneath the earth. "Julian," she said urgently, gripping his arm, "stay with me. Do not let them push you into losing yourself." But the soldiers advanced regardless, and when one of them raised a blade toward Julian's chest, something inside him finally broke free. The transformation was not monstrous, not the way old stories might have described a creature born of nightmares. Instead, it was something far stranger and more beautiful. A soft golden light began to emanate from beneath Julian's skin, tracing the same symbols that had been etched into the ancient armor hidden in his study. His eyes shifted from their usual quiet brown to a bright, burning gold, and the wind around him began to swirl with sudden, controlled force, as if the very air had chosen to obey him. The soldiers froze, their earlier confidence crumbling into visible fear. Even Ashford took an involuntary step backward, his composure slipping for the first time. "Leave this house," Julian said, and his voice carried an unnatural resonance, layered with something ancient and vast, though it remained unmistakably his own. "I will not ask again." For a long tense moment, nobody moved. Then one of the soldiers, younger and less certain than the others, lowered his weapon and took a hesitant step back toward the gate. His retreat broke the spell of frozen fear, and one by one, the others followed, until only Ashford remained, staring at Julian with a mixture of fear and fascination. "So the rumors were true," Ashford said quietly. "The bloodline has fully awakened. This changes everything, Voss. You have no idea what forces will come looking for you now that the truth is confirmed." "Then let them come," Julian said. "I have protected this house before, and I will protect it again." Ashford studied him for a long moment before finally turning to leave, mounting his horse with careful, measured movements. "This is not over," he called back as he rode toward the gate. "The Empire does not simply walk away from power like yours." Mira watched the soldiers disappear down the road, her heart still hammering in her chest, before she turned back to Julian, who stood trembling, the golden light slowly fading from beneath his skin, as his eyes returned to their familiar warm brown. "Julian," she said softly, reaching out to steady him, as his knees nearly buckled beneath the exhaustion of what had just happened. "I'm here," he said, his voice hoarse. I stayed myself. I stayed in control. You protected us, Mira said, guiding him toward a nearby bench to sit. You did not lose yourself, Julian. You chose to protect this house, and you succeeded. He looked down at his own hands, still faintly trembling, as if seeing them for the first time. I have never done that before. Not fully. Not while remaining myself the entire time. Because you were not alone this time, Mira said gently. You had something to hold on to. Word of what happened at the Voss estate spread quickly through the surrounding town, carried by the fleeing soldiers, and embellished with each retelling, until it reached every household within a day's journey. Some villagers reacted with renewed fear, avoiding the estate entirely, crossing to the other side of the road whenever they needed to pass near its gates. But others reacted differently, arriving quietly at the door with small gifts of food or offers of help, grateful that Julian had stood against the Empire's soldiers, rather than allowing them free reign over the town. An old farmer named Elias, who had lived near the estate for decades, was the first to speak openly of what he had witnessed from a distance. The Empire has taken good men from this town before, he said, standing at the gate with his cap in his hands. Taken them for their wars, and never returned them the same, if they returned at all. If you can stand against them, Voss, you will find more allies here than you might expect. Julian, still recovering from the encounter, was cautious in his response. I do not seek to become a symbol of rebellion, Elias. I only wish to protect my home. Sometimes, Elias said with a small, knowing smile, protecting one's home is exactly how rebellions begin. In the days that followed, Mira watched her husband grapple with the reality of what he had become in the eyes of the town. No longer simply the quiet, feared master of the Voss estate, he was becoming something else entirely, a figure of hope for those who had long suffered under the Empire's distant, uncaring rule, and a figure of dangerous fascination for those who wished to control the power he carried. Late one evening, as they sat together in the study where his family's secrets had long been hidden, Julian finally voiced the fear that had been building inside him since Ashford's visit. They will not stop coming, Mira, he said quietly. Ashford made that clear. And each time I am forced to use this power, it grows harder to remain fully myself. I fear what might happen if I am pushed too far, too many times. Then we prepare, Mira said firmly. We learn everything we can about this power, about your family's history, about what might help you control it more fully. You are not facing an unknown threat blindly anymore, Julian. Now we know what we are up against. Julian reached for the old chest containing his great-grandfather's armor and, for the first time, lifted the breastplate fully into the candlelight, studying the ancient symbols etched across its surface with newfound purpose rather than fear. My great-grandfather left journals, he said slowly, as if the memory had only just surfaced. I have never read them fully. I was always too afraid of what I might find within their pages. Then let us read them together, Mira said. Whatever answers exist, we will find them side by side. Over the following days, the two of them pored over the fragile, yellowed pages of the journal left behind by Julian's ancestor, learning fragments of the original bargain, the price paid, and hints of ways the power might be steadied rather than simply suppressed. It was slow, careful work, filled with confusing passages and half-finished thoughts left behind by a man who had clearly struggled to understand his own transformation, just as Julian now struggled with his. But amid the confusion, one phrase appeared again and again throughout the journal's pages, underlined and circled, as if the old soldier had wanted desperately for someone, someday, to understand its importance. The power does not wish to destroy. It wishes only to protect what its bearer holds most dear. Anchor yourself to that which you love, and you will never lose yourself entirely. Mira looked up from the journal to find Julian watching her, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet candlelight. I think I understand now, Julian said softly, why it answered so fully when they threatened this house. Why it answered so fully when they threatened you. Then we know what keeps you steady, Mira said, reaching for his hand across the desk. Whatever comes next, Julian, you will not face it without an anchor. Outside, the night had grown still and quiet, the earlier tension of the soldier's visit fading into the calm resolve of two people who had chosen, against all odds, to stand together. But far beyond the estate's borders, in the halls of the Empire's capital, Colonel Ashford was already delivering his report to superiors, far more dangerous and far more determined than he was, setting into motion events that would soon test the full strength of Julian's newfound resolve, and the depth of the bond he had built with the woman who had once been nothing more than a debt paid in marriage. The Empire, it seemed, was not the only power now taking interest in what slept within the Voss bloodline. Word of a soldier who had turned golden light against armed men would not stay contained within the borders of one small town for long, and soon, far greater dangers would begin making their way toward the quiet estate at the edge of the forest. News of the confrontation reached farther than either Julian or Mira expected. Within a week, travelers passing through the region began speaking of a man near the northern forest who had turned back armed soldiers with nothing but light and wind. Some called it a miracle, others called it a warning. Either way, the story grew with each retelling, until it no longer resembled the quiet, controlled defense Julian had actually shown at his gate. A merchant named Dorian arrived at the estate one gray morning, claiming to represent a group of scholars interested in old bloodline legends. Julian was wary from the first moment, sensing something calculated behind the man's polite smile and careful questions. "We only wish to understand," Dorian said, seated at the long dining table with a cup of tea he had barely touched. "Bloodlines like yours are exceedingly rare, Mr. Voss. Some would call them sacred. Some would call them dangerous," Julian replied evenly. "I have no interest in being studied, sacred or otherwise." Dorian's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered briefly behind his eyes. "A pity. There are those who believe such power should be shared, guided, rather than hidden away in a forgotten corner of the countryside. Those who believe that," Mira said sharply, "have not asked what the man himself wants." Dorian's gaze shifted to her, assessing, the same way Ashford's had weeks before. "The wife speaks boldly." "The wife speaks for herself," Mira answered without hesitation. After Dorian left, promising vaguely that he would return with others who shared his interest, Julian paced the length of the study, clearly unsettled in a way the earlier soldiers had not managed to provoke. "He is not with the Empire," Julian said, "but he is something else, something patient, and that frightens me more." "Patient people plan carefully," Mira said, "which means we must plan just as carefully in return." They spent the following evenings expanding their study of the old journal, cross-referencing its fragile pages with older town records Elias helped them gather from the village archive. Slowly, a clearer picture began to form. Julian's bloodline was not the only one the Empire and its shadowy rivals had taken interest in over the generations. Others had carried similar bargains, similar burdens, and most had ended in tragedy, either consumed entirely by the power they carried, or hunted down by those who wished to control it. "I do not want to become another entry in someone's forgotten ledger," Julian said one night, closing the journal with careful, deliberate hands. "I do not want my story to end the way so many of theirs did." "It will not," Mira said, with a certainty that surprised even herself. "Because unlike them, you are not facing this alone, and you are not hiding from what you are anymore. You are learning to understand it." Elias, when consulted, offered his own quiet wisdom, born of decades spent watching the Empire's reach extend further into every corner of ordinary life. "The Empire fears what it cannot fully control," the old farmer said, leaning against the garden fence one afternoon. "And men like that merchant fear what they cannot fully claim for themselves. But power that is understood, and shared willingly, rather than stolen, tends to frighten both kinds of men far more than raw strength ever could." "What do you mean?" Julian asked. "I mean the town has seen what you did at your gate," Elias said, "and the town remembers every soldier taken from their families for wars they never chose. If it ever comes to open conflict, Voss, you would not stand alone. Remember that." The words settled over Julian in a way that seemed to steady something deep within him, a quiet reassurance that his fight, should it come, would not be his burden alone to carry. As autumn deepened and the nights grew colder, life at the estate found a strange, fragile rhythm of vigilance, mixed with something almost like peace. Julian continued his morning work in the fields, though now Mira often joined him, learning the small satisfactions of tending land alongside a man who had slowly, carefully, become far more than a husband of convenience to her. Evenings were spent poring over old records or simply sitting together beneath the same oak tree where Julian had first confessed his grief, on the night after their wedding. It was beneath that same tree, weeks later, that Julian finally spoke the words neither of them had dared voice aloud until then. I did not choose this marriage, he said quietly, watching the last light of sunset fade behind the hills. But I would choose you again, Mira, every single time, if given the chance. Mira felt her chest tighten, with an emotion far warmer than the cold evening air should have allowed. I would choose you too, she said softly, not out of duty, not anymore. For the first time since the wedding, Julian leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, careful and reverent, as if she were something precious he still could not quite believe belonged to his quiet, complicated life. But even as the two of them found solace in each other beneath the darkening sky, forces far beyond their control continued moving steadily closer, drawn by whispers of golden light and ancient power, converging toward the small estate that had, against every expectation, become the center of a much larger and far more dangerous story. The attack came without warning, on a night when the moon hid behind heavy clouds, and the wind carried an unnatural stillness across the estate. Mira woke to the sound of shattering glass, followed immediately by shouts and the heavy thud of boots against the wooden floors below. Her heart lurched into her throat as she scrambled from bed, grabbing the nearest heavy object she could find for protection. Julian was already awake, already moving, his expression grim and focused as he met her in the hallway. "Stay close to me," he said. "This is not Ashford's men. Their uniforms are different." Downstairs, a group of armed men had broken through the front entrance, led by Dorian himself, his earlier polite smile, now replaced with cold determination. Behind him stood several others dressed in dark, unmarked clothing, carrying strange devices Mira did not recognize, humming faintly, with some kind of contained energy. "I did warn you I would return," Dorian said, his voice carrying easily through the ruined entryway. "Though I confess, I had hoped you would come willingly. It would have been far less destructive for everyone involved." "You have no right to be in this house," Julian said, positioning himself protectively in front of Mira, as Grace and the remaining household workers gathered fearfully behind them. "Rights are for those with the power to enforce them," Dorian replied. "And soon, that power will belong to us." He gestured to the strange devices his men carried. "These were built specifically to contain bloodlines like yours, Voss, extracted from years of studying survivors just like you. You will not even have the chance to fight back." Before Julian could respond, the men activated their devices, and Mira watched in horror as thin, glowing restraints shot forward, wrapping around Julian's arms and chest with sudden, crushing force. Julian gasped, his knees buckling, as the restraints seemed to actively suppress the golden light that had once flowed so freely beneath his skin during the confrontation with Ashford's soldiers. "Julian," Mira cried, rushing forward despite the danger, only to be caught and held back by one of Dorian's men. "Do not struggle, my lady," Dorian said calmly. "It will be over quickly, and then you will understand that we mean no true harm to either of you, only a necessary transfer of a power that was never meant to remain hidden in a single, stubborn bloodline." Julian struggled against the restraints, his breathing ragged, his eyes locked onto Mira's terrified face. "Do not touch her," he growled, his voice straining with effort. "Whatever you do to me, leave her out of this." "That decision," Dorian said, "depends entirely on how cooperative you choose to be." Mira watched helplessly as the restraints tightened further, and for a horrifying moment, she feared Julian might truly be overwhelmed, his strength failing beneath a device specifically designed to suppress exactly what made him who he was. But then she remembered the words from his great-grandfather's journal, underlined so many times upon its fragile pages. "Anchor yourself to that which you love, and you will never lose yourself entirely." "Julian, look at me," Mira called out, ignoring the tightening grip of the man restraining her. "Do not fight the restraints. Fight for what matters. Fight for us." Julian's eyes found hers across the chaos of the ruined entryway, and something in his expression steadied, focused, despite the crushing pressure of the devices meant to contain him. The golden light did not simply return. It surged, brighter and more controlled than Mira had ever witnessed before, not born of desperation or fear, but of quiet, unshakable resolve. The restraints, designed to suppress raw, chaotic power, could not contain something that had learned, however recently, to remain steady and purposeful, even beneath immense pressure. The devices shattered with a sound like breaking glass, amplified tenfold, and Dorian's men stumbled backward in shock as Julian rose fully to his feet, the golden light no longer wild and untethered, but focused, deliberate, entirely his own. "I told you," Julian said, his voice carrying that same layered resonance from before, though steadier now, more controlled. "Leave this house." Dorian, to his credit, did not flee immediately, though his composure had clearly cracked. "Impressive," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "But you cannot protect this house, and this town, and this woman, forever, Voss. Eventually, exhaustion will claim you, or someone will find a method our devices could not achieve. Then I will face that day when it comes," Julian said, "but it will not be today." The remaining light around him pulsed once, sending a wave of controlled force through the entryway that knocked Dorian's men from their feet without causing lasting harm. A restraint Mira noticed, even amid the chaos. A deliberate choice to protect, rather than destroy. Dorian, seeing his men scrambling to retreat, cast one final, calculating glance toward Julian, before following them out into the night. "This is far from finished," he called back, echoing Ashford's earlier warning, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the shattered entrance. The golden light slowly faded from Julian's skin as the immediate danger passed, and he swayed unsteadily on his feet, the effort of the confrontation finally catching up to him. Mira rushed forward, catching him before he could fall, guiding him gently to sit amid the wreckage of their front hall. "You held on," she said softly, cradling his face in her hands. "Even with those restraints, you held on." "Because you reminded me what I was fighting for," Julian said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Not fighting against them, Mira. Fighting for you. For this life we are building together." In the days following the attack, the household worked together to repair the damage to the estate, though the deeper wounds left by the confrontation could not be mended so easily. Word spread quickly through the town of the attack, and this time, rather than fear, the villagers responded with something closer to solidarity. Small groups began arriving at the estate's gates, offering help with repairs, offering information about strangers spotted near the town's borders, offering whatever quiet support they could provide, to a man who had twice now stood between them and forces that wished to claim power, without regard for the people caught beneath its weight. Elias organized a rotating watch among the town's able-bodied men, ensuring that any strangers approaching the estate would be noticed long before they reached its gates. Grace, though shaken by the violence she had witnessed, refused to leave her position within the household, insisting that the Voss family had cared for her for decades, and she would not abandon them now that they needed loyalty most. "We are no longer facing this alone," Julian said, one evening, watching from the repaired front steps as several townsfolk worked to reinforce the estate's outer walls. "I did not expect that. I spent so many years believing my burden had to remain hidden, had to remain solitary." "Burdens shared become lighter," Mira said, standing beside him. "You taught this town that standing against the Empire's cruelty was possible. Now they are choosing to stand with you in return." But even as the town rallied around them, Mira could see the toll the repeated confrontations were taking on her husband. He slept less, trained more, spending hours each day in quiet meditation, with the ancient armor his great-grandfather had once worn, trying desperately to understand the fullness of the power he carried, before it could be tested again by an enemy far more determined and far more dangerous than either Ashford or Dorian had proven to be. "They will not stop sending smaller forces," Julian said one night, studying the journal's final pages with a troubled expression. "Eventually, they will commit fully. An army, perhaps, backed by whatever resources the Empire and its rivals are willing to spend to claim what I carry." "Then we prepare for that day," Mira said. "Together. Whatever it takes." Julian looked up from the journal, meeting her eyes with a mixture of gratitude and quiet determination. "Whatever it takes," he repeated softly. "I believe, for the first time since that battlefield, that I might actually be ready to face it." Neither of them could have known how soon that readiness would be tested, nor how completely the coming confrontation would demand everything they had built together in the short, precious months since a debt had first bound them as husband and wife. A week after the failed attempt to capture him, Julian received a message carried by a nervous young courier who refused to say who had sent him, only that he had been paid well to deliver it, and then vanish. Julian opened the sealed letter alone in his study, And when Mira found him there afterward, his face had gone pale, in a way she had not seen since the night the soldiers first arrived at their gate. "What is it?" she asked, crossing the room quickly. He handed her the letter without a word. It was brief, written in careful, precise handwriting that gave nothing away of its author's identity. "The bloodline cannot be contained by force alone," it read. "The Empire has decided a different approach is required. If Voss will not surrender the power willingly, then those he loves will be made to understand the cost of his refusal. You have until the next full moon to reconsider." Mira read the words twice, her hands trembling slightly as the meaning settled fully into place. "They mean to threaten the town," she said. "Or me." "I will not let either happen," Julian said, his voice hard with a fury Mira had rarely heard from him. "Then we cannot simply wait for the full moon to arrive," Mira said, forcing herself to think clearly despite the fear coiling in her chest. "We need to understand who is truly behind this." Ashford represented the Empire directly. Dorian claimed to represent scholars, though his methods suggested something far more organized and dangerous. If they are now working together, or if a third party has entered this conflict, we need to know before we can plan any true defense. Elias, when consulted the following morning, brought troubling news of his own. Strangers had been spotted near the northern road, dressed in the same unmarked dark clothing Dorian's men had worn during the attack, but moving in far greater numbers than before, setting up what appeared to be a temporary camp just beyond the tree line. "They are not hiding their presence anymore," Elias said grimly, "which means they are no longer worried about you noticing them before they are ready to move." Julian spent that afternoon reviewing his great-grandfather's journal one final time, searching for any remaining fragment of guidance that might help him prepare for a confrontation far larger than anything he had yet faced. Near the very last page, tucked into a fold of aging paper, he found a hand-drawn map, faded but still legible, marking a location deep within the forest that the journal referred to only as the place where the bargain was first spoken. "If there is any place where I might learn to fully master what I carry," Julian said, showing Mira the map, "it would be there. Where my great-grandfather first made this bargain." "Then we go there," Mira said without hesitation. "Before the full moon. Before they force your hand." "It could be dangerous," Julian warned. "I do not know what remains at that location after all these years, nor what price might still be attached to seeking answers there." "I have followed you this far," Mira said, taking his hand firmly. "I am not stopping now." Julian studied her for a long moment. Something like awe, mixing with the exhaustion and worry, etched across his features. "I do not deserve someone as steady as you," he said quietly. "You deserve exactly this," Mira replied. "Someone who chooses to stand beside you, not out of duty, but because I cannot imagine choosing anything else." That night, as preparations began for the journey into the forest, Grace pressed a small satchel of supplies into Mira's hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Bring him home safely, my lady," she said. "This family has lost too much already." "I intend to," Mira promised. "Both of us, together." As dawn broke the following morning, Julian and Mira set out from the estate, leaving behind the fragile safety of the home they had built together, venturing instead toward the heart of the forest, where an old bargain had first been spoken generations before, unaware that the answers waiting for them there would demand a price far steeper than either of them could yet imagine. The forest grew stranger the deeper they traveled, the trees twisting into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if something ancient still watched over this hidden place, after all the years since Julian's great-grandfather had first made his desperate bargain here. By the second day of travel, following the faded map with careful precision, they reached a small clearing, where a ring of standing stones rose from the earth, weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain, each one etched with the same symbols that marked Julian's ancient armor. "This is the place," Julian said quietly, stepping into the clearing with a reverence Mira had never seen from him before. At the center of the stone circle stood a single, larger monolith, its surface catching the afternoon light in a way that seemed almost alive. Julian approached slowly, placing his palm against its cool surface, and immediately, the symbols across the entire circle began to glow, with the same golden light that lived within him. A voice, ancient and vast, seemed to rise from the very stones themselves, speaking not in words exactly, but in impressions that settled directly into their minds. It spoke of the original bargain, of a desperate soldier who had begged for the strength to save his men, of the price paid across generations, and of a purpose the power had always carried, waiting patiently for a bearer who would choose to wield it, not from fear or desperation, but from love and deliberate will. You have already found the anchor that generations before you searched for in vain, the voice seemed to say. The bond you carry with the one beside you is stronger than any bargain struck in desperation. Choose now, fully and freely, whether you accept this power as your own, not as a curse inherited, but as a strength chosen. Julian closed his eyes, and Mira watched as the golden light around him steadied into something calm and complete, no longer a fragment of ancient power merely tolerated within his blood, but something fully integrated, fully his own. I accept it, Julian said clearly, his voice resonating through the clearing, not as a burden forced upon my bloodline, but as a strength I choose to carry, for the protection of those I love. The light pulsed once, brilliant and warm, before settling gently back beneath his skin, and when Julian opened his eyes again, Mira saw a difference immediately, a quiet, steady confidence that had not been present before, as if some final piece of doubt had finally been resolved. How do you feel? She asked softly. Whole, Julian answered, sounding almost surprised by the word himself. For the first time since that battlefield, I feel entirely whole. They did not have long to process this newfound clarity, however, before the sound of approaching soldiers echoed through the trees, far too many voices and footsteps to belong to a small scouting party. Julian's expression hardened immediately, and he pulled Mira close. They followed us, he said grimly. Or they anticipated exactly where we would go. Moments later, the clearing filled with soldiers in the Empire's dark uniforms, led once again by Colonel Ashford, though this time flanked by Dorian as well, confirming Mira's earlier suspicion that the two forces had indeed combined their efforts against a threat they considered too dangerous to remain independent. You have led us directly to the source, Dorian said, surveying the glowing stone circle with undisguised fascination. Even better than we hoped. This ends now, Voss, Ashford added, drawing his weapon. Either you surrender willingly, or we take what we need by force, whatever the cost. Julian stepped forward, placing himself firmly between the soldiers and Mira, though this time, his stance carried none of the fear or hesitation from their previous encounters. You will not take anything from me, he said calmly. Not today, not ever. The battle that followed was unlike anything Mira had witnessed before. Julian moved with a controlled, deliberate power, the golden light responding instantly to his will, rather than surging unpredictably as it once had. He did not seek to harm the soldiers unnecessarily, instead using controlled bursts of force to disarm and disable, protecting both himself and the ancient site from destruction, even as he faced down dozens of armed opponents at once. Ashford, watching his forces steadily fall back despite their numbers, finally drew a strange device of his own, larger and more sophisticated than the restraints Dorian's men had used before. If we cannot claim the power, he shouted, then no one shall have it. He activated the device, and immediately, dark energy began pulling at the stone circle itself, threatening to shatter the ancient monoliths, and, with them, the source of the bargain that had shaped Julian's entire bloodline. Julian, the stones, Mira cried. Julian turned, understanding immediately what Ashford intended. If the source of the original bargain was destroyed violently rather than resolved naturally, the resulting backlash could be catastrophic, not only for Julian himself, but for the entire clearing and everyone within it. I need to reach the center stone, Julian said urgently, but Ashford's men will not let me pass easily. Then let me help clear your path, Mira said, surprising him with sudden determination, as she grabbed a fallen soldier's abandoned weapon, not to harm anyone, but to create the diversion Julian needed. Working together, they pushed through the chaos of the battle, Julian's controlled power clearing obstacles, while Mira's quick thinking and fearless resolve kept them moving steadily toward the central monolith, despite Ashford's increasingly desperate attempts to stop them. When they finally reached the stone, the destructive energy from Ashford's device had already begun cracking its ancient surface, threatening imminent collapse. Julian placed both hands against the stone, channeling the full, steady strength of his fully accepted power directly into stabilizing the ancient structure. The effort was immense, visibly straining him, but this time, rather than facing the challenge alone, Mira stood beside him, her hand resting firmly against his back, offering the same quiet, unwavering support that had steadied him through every previous trial. "I cannot hold this and fight Ashford's device at the same time," Julian said through gritted teeth. "Then let me handle Ashford," Mira said, and before Julian could protest, she turned and moved decisively toward the colonel, who stood transfixed by the chaos he had unleashed. "Call off your device," Mira demanded, standing firm despite the danger. "You are not just threatening Julian. You are threatening to unleash something far more destructive than either you or Dorian can control." Ashford hesitated, clearly torn between his desperate desire to prevent Julian from claiming full mastery over his power, and genuine concern for the catastrophic consequences, now visibly building within the cracking stone circle. "Look around you," Mira continued, gesturing to his own soldiers, many of whom had stopped fighting entirely, staring in growing alarm at the unstable energy now crackling dangerously across the clearing. "Your men do not wish to die for a power they were never meant to control. End this now, before it is too late for all of us." Something in her words, or perhaps in the visible desperation of his own retreating forces, finally broke through Ashford's determination. With a frustrated, defeated motion, he deactivated the device, and the destructive pull on the ancient stones ceased immediately, allowing Julian to fully stabilize the cracked monolith with a final, steady surge of golden light. The clearing fell into exhausted silence as the immediate danger passed. Ashford, surveying the wreckage of his failed mission and the clear devotion binding Julian and Mira together, despite every obstacle thrown against them, finally lowered his weapon entirely. This power was never meant to be stolen, he admitted quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Perhaps it was always meant to remain exactly where it is. He signaled his remaining soldiers to withdraw, and Dorian, recognizing the shifting tide, chose not to argue further, following Ashford's retreat without another word. As the last of the soldiers disappeared back into the forest, Julian finally allowed himself to sink to his knees beside the now stable monolith, utterly exhausted but, for the first time, entirely at peace. Mira knelt beside him immediately, wrapping her arms around him without hesitation. "You did it," she said softly. "You protected everyone, and you did not lose yourself doing it." "We did it," Julian corrected gently, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. "I could not have found this peace without you, Mira. Not the strength to accept what I carry, and not the strength to protect it once accepted." In the weeks that followed their return to the estate, life slowly settled into a new, steadier rhythm. Word of the confrontation in the forest spread throughout the region, and this time, rather than fear or fascination, the story that traveled from town to town spoke of a man who had chosen to master an ancient power, not for conquest, but for protection, standing beside a wife who had refused to let him face that burden alone. The Empire, weakened by Ashford's failed mission, and wary of the growing loyalty the surrounding towns now held for the Voss estate, chose not to pursue further direct confrontation, at least for the foreseeable future. Dorian and his shadowy associates likewise retreated into quiet obscurity, unwilling to risk further exposure after witnessing firsthand the full extent of what Julian had become. Elias organized a small gathering at the estate to celebrate the town's continued safety, and for the first time since her arrival, Mira watched Julian move among the villagers, not as a feared, mysterious figure, but as a respected and trusted neighbor, his quiet strength now openly acknowledged rather than whispered about in fearful rumors. "You have given this town something it has not felt in a long time," Elias said to Julian during the celebration, raising a cup in quiet toast. "Hope that standing against overwhelming power is not simply foolish, but possible, when done for the right reasons." Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed and quiet settled once more over the estate, Julian and Mira stood together beneath the same old oak tree, where their story together had truly begun months before. "I never imagined," Julian said softly, "that a marriage born from my father's debt would become the very thing that saved me." "I never imagined," Mira replied, leaning into him, "that duty could grow into something as strong as what we have built together." Julian turned to face her fully, his eyes warm and steady in the soft moonlight, no longer haunted by the battlefield memories that had once consumed him so completely. Whatever comes next, Mira, whatever the Empire, or anyone else attempts in the future, I know now that I do not face it as a weapon, or a curse, or even simply as a soldier who survived when others did not. Then what do you face it as? Mira asked softly. As a man, Julian said, who chose, freely and completely, the woman standing beside him. A man who found, in the midst of an ancient and terrible power, something far more valuable than strength alone. And what is that? Mira asked, though she already knew the answer glowing plainly in his eyes. Home, Julian said simply. I found home. As the stars stretched endlessly above the quiet estate, Mira Calden, once bound to a stranger by nothing more than her father's debt, stood instead beside a man who had risen from the depths of ancient power, not as a weapon for others to claim, but as something far rarer and far more precious, a human heart, steady and whole, who had chosen love over fear, and had found, in that choice, the truest strength of all. In the months that followed, the estate slowly transformed, from a place of quiet isolation into something closer to the heart of the surrounding community. Julian, once known only through fearful whispers, began holding open gatherings at the edge of his land, teaching young men and women from the town simple skills of farming and craftsmanship, using the same patient hands that had once wielded ancient power to instead build something lasting and ordinary. Mira often joined him, and together they became a familiar, welcome presence throughout the region, their story softened by time into something the town spoke of with pride rather than fear. Grace, watching the transformation with quiet satisfaction, often remarked that she had not seen the estate feel so alive since long before Julian's father had passed. This house was built for more than silence, she told Mira, one afternoon, while they worked together in the garden. You brought that back to it, my lady. Both of you did, together. Still, neither Julian nor Mira allowed themselves to grow entirely complacent. The threat of the Empire's continued interest never fully vanished, and reports occasionally reached them of Ashford's quiet reassignment to a distant post, or of Dorian's shadowy associates regrouping under a different name in a different region. But each time such news arrived, Julian faced it with the same steady calm he had found within the ancient stone circle, no longer haunted by fear of what he might become, but grounded firmly in the choice he had made to wield his strength for protection rather than conquest. One quiet evening, nearly a year after their wedding, Julian led Mira back to the same small chapel where they had first been married, under circumstances neither of them had chosen. This time, no debt hung over their heads. No stranger waited to deliver unwelcome news. Only the two of them stood together beneath the chapel's worn arches, the same village priest smiling warmly as he watched Julian take Mira's hands in his own. I know we are already married, Julian said, his voice steady with quiet emotion. But I wanted to say the words again, fully, as a choice rather than an obligation. Mira Calden, I choose you, not out of duty and not out of debt, but because you are the reason I learned to become whole. Mira, her eyes bright with unshed tears, tightened her hold on his hands. And I choose you, Julian Voss. Not the soldier the Empire once tried to claim, and not the deity others feared or coveted, but the man who chose, every single day, to be gentle, despite the power he carried. Outside the chapel, the golden light of sunset spilled softly through the windows, catching for just a moment on the faint, familiar glow that still lived quietly beneath Julian's skin, no longer a burden hidden away in fear, but a strength embraced fully, standing steady beside the woman who had first seen the man beneath the myth, and had chosen, against every expectation placed upon her, to stay. Their story, once begun as a debt paid through obligation, had become instead a testament to something far rarer, the quiet, powerful choice two people make, again and again, to stand beside one another through fear, through danger, and through the slow, steady work of building a life worth protecting. And in the years that followed, whenever travelers passed through the small town near the edge of the forest, they would hear the story told not as a warning, but as a promise, that even power born from desperation and old bargains could be shaped, gently and deliberately, into something worthy of love. That a marriage born from duty could grow into devotion, and that sometimes the rarest kind of strength was not the ability to rise as a weapon of war, but the choice to remain, Above all else, entirely and unshakably human.